All righty, worksheet 20. What will happen to PLC terminal connections over time? They will eventually loosen. If there is a screw involved, it will loosen. And the reason it will loosen is because as screws heat and cool around the threads that they're in, things can expand and contract at different rates. And eventually they will loosen. And so there needs to be a PM program implemented to occasionally check the terminal screws. Although most people are now doing the thermal imaging camera, but I don't think your connections on your PLCs are going to get that hot, so it may not show up in camera, but they're still going to get loose. And then you'll start seeing strange behavior. Once most of the time the input will make, and then sometimes it won't. And so if you haven't tightened your terminal connections in a while, be a good time to do it. Probably once a year, once every 2 years. If you try and do a interval once every 2 years, you'll forget it. So if it's once a year, that's about what you want. What must a technician be cognizant of in terms of PLC applications within a panel as a maintenance concern? A PLC, as you know, and we discussed at the very first of the class, can have multiple power sources. And so your input cards, your output cards, your analog cards, and your processor could all be on different power supplies. So if you're working on a PLC system, making sure things are off or de-energized before you work on it takes an extra step or an extra thought to make sure that you've got it taken care of. Some PLCs have batteries. Where's the schedule found for changing them? If you've got an older PLC, there's a battery in it for its memory. Not unlike the battery in most computers that's looks like a quarter. And they need to be changed once in a while. The batteries need to be changed. If the PLC never loses power, it's not that big a deal, but the battery is what keeps the memory going. Okay. Now, from a practical standpoint, some companies are very diligent about changing batteries, others are not. The latest batteries are the lithiums, which go, 5-10 years. Which means it's more likely to get forgotten actually, but you do it fewer times. So you've got that to think about. So in terms of your PLC, whatever PLC you're working on, that's one of the things you probably want to look up in the manual. Does it have batteries? How often should I change them? When I started in the field, it was either C or D cells, and they were supposed to get done once a year. The PLCs we now have capacitors. The Click PLC that you have has a capacitor, and the capacitor stores charge if it's plugged in, and then it maintains its charge when you unplug it to keep the memory happy. But eventually the capacitor will run down. The nice thing about a capacitor is there's no batteries to ever change. But what you will see on the Click PLC that you've got is if you leave it unplugged long enough, that capacitor will run down below a certain threshold value. And when you turn it back on, it will have a fault. And you'll have a blinking red light. And to clear that fault, you unplug it and then count to 10, plug it back in. And what you're doing is you're telling the PLC to reset that fault, and it's because the capacitor bled down all the way. But like I said, a lot of companies forget to change the battery, so capacitors are probably a better option. What happens if the battery dies or the capacitor fails and power is lost to the processor? Generally, it won't lose its mind, but anything can really happen. I've noticed with the clicks that even if it comes on saying the capacitor had gotten down below a certain threshold, the program and everything's still good. So probably what's happening is they won't guarantee it's good, but there is some margin that you can get by with. And the processor will be good and the program will be good and things won't randomly change on you. If from an electronic standpoint, if you lose your memory and your battery on your memory, then things can start changing and become more random, and then you don't know what's going to happen. So you can't predict it. It's something you want to avoid. So most industries are going to keep their PLCs powered. If the power fails for a little while, the capacitor is usually good enough. If you got a battery in there, you need to change the batteries. And you just want to avoid that because you really don't know what will happen. How can a panel be cooled with compressed air? This is interesting. When you compress air, it gives up heat in order to fit in a very tightly compressed space. So when you let compressed air get to a panel and then expand, it actually will suck the heat out of the air because it's taking heat for that air to expand back. So it actually pulls heat out of the air. You might not think it works, but I've seen them. There's an industry that I used to work at, makes fiber optic cable. We had little what they call vortex coolers in all their outside panels, and those were actually cooler on a hot day than the ambient air around them for sure. Now, what do I mean by an anti-tie down circuit? I try to describe it, so let's go through this. You got two separate buttons, push buttons, pressed nearly simultaneously, and I say within a quarter of a second, but if you're using a timer, you know you can adjust that time. So let's just start with a quarter of a second. Will cause a 5-second cycle to start and complete if the buttons are continuously held. So I've got to push two buttons within a quarter second of each other to cause this 5-second cycle to start and complete. I've got to push and hold. Okay. Now, what operators will do is if you tell them they got to push two buttons at the same time, they'll say, okay, but once you walk off, they're going to cheat one. That way they can hold their cell phone with one hand and they can do the process with the other, which wouldn't be too bad. Most of the time when you have to have two buttons pushed, that means they want to know where your hands are, so your hands are not in there where they could get crushed or maimed. So that's what the anti-tie down circuit is in general. So now what happens if I cheat a button? So if I hold one down all the time, put a heavy object on it, will the cycle work just by pushing the other button? And it should not. And then as long as the buttons are held, the cycle completes. And if I'm in the cycle or done with the cycle and I release one of the buttons, the cycle stops. And it should be repeatable. So if you push both buttons and you let one off early, you let both of them off, you push them again, you should be able to get a cycle. If you push and hold, you get a cycle, you release, then you should be able to push and hold again and get a cycle. And where is this used? This is used everywhere that you want operators to be safe. It's one of the safety circuits that you see. And people actually buy little systems that do this. So you would program that, test it, make sure it works. You can use your green button and your red button as your two buttons. Test it, comment it, turn it in. That is the anti-tie down circuit, and that is worksheet 20.